Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Phipps. I'm an assistant curator at the Whitney Museum, and I'm really happy to be here with you all tonight. Before we get going, I want to remind those that would like to access closed captioning that they can do so by turning on the feature in the option bar below. And really want to say thank you so much to Corey Dosty who will be providing the captions for the program. So we can go ahead and move to the next slide. Great. So once again, thank you all for joining us this evening for a conversation about the exhibition around Day's End and about 4 artists whose practices shaped the exhibition. And our conversation, the exhibition, all begins in a way with David Hammons' proposal for Day's End, an ethereal and practically invisible work of public art that really invites meditation on not only the Gordon Matta-Clark work that inspired it, but also on the absence or the invisibility of many histories of the site, of the neighborhood, of the city. And I want to acknowledge that all of the sites that we're thinking and talking about tonight are the homelands of the Lenape people who were forcefully displaced and rendered invisible by European settlers and their descendants to create New York City, and who now live as a diaspora across the US and Canada. And I personally am speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded lands of the Canarsie and Munsee Lenape in Brooklyn. And because we are gathered here tonight from so many different locales, I want to encourage everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous lands that you're tuning in from, to reflect on the privilege of the technology and our ability to be here tonight, and to consider ways to support Indigenous people, for example, in New York, giving to the Mannahatta Fund, supporting the American Indian Community House, which is a community partner of the Whitney. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us. It's really special to be able to share this digital space and to have such an expanded audience this evening. So I'm really excited for the program, and I'm anxious to get right into these presentations and the discussion. But I do want to provide a little bit of a frame and background of the exhibition, starting really back in 2014, when David Hammons visited the construction site that was soon to be the Whitney Museum. Hammons spent much of this visit actually reflecting not on the site of the museum, but actually out onto the waterfront, and was at that time learning about the museum's proximity to the site of Gordon Matta-Clark's 1975 work, Day's End. The Matta-Clark work was an intervention on the pier shed that had existed on Pier 52 across the street from the museum. It comprised 5 massive cuts into the walls and floors and ceilings of the building, opening it in a way to the Hudson River beyond. Go to the next slide. So after this visit, Hammond sent the museum a drawing with a proposal for a monument to Matta-Clark's Day's End, and something that we received at the museum as a bit of a provocation, a challenge, a question, could we make this happen? And now, after years of planning, working with the artist, working with engineers and all sorts of different entities, the structure that was proposed by Hammons, which will precisely follow the outlines, the dimensions, and the location of the original shed that Matta-Clark cut into, will be completed later this year. And this project is also titled Day's End. So we can go to the next slide. So as I alluded to, the exhibition around Day's End was conceived to think about a context for this upcoming Hammons installation. And it also centers the inspiration for it, the Matta-Clark work. So through works from the Whitney's permanent collection, the show really attempts to create a context by looking at ways that artists were engaged with the city in the 70s and 80s. And the presentation, the show features selected works by artists who explored the meatpacking district, the neighborhood that the museum is currently in, the West Side Piers, among other downtown Manhattan locations and neighborhoods like the Brooklyn Bridge, East Village, the Bowery. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. We thought about this artistic engagement in a number of ways, physically, using the material of the city, also about leaning into site specificity and performance, and to also really look at the social issues that the city was facing at the time. And the time frame of the show, though large, was also purposeful. The 70s and 80s presented particular economic conditions, which many artists were not only living through, but also responding to in particular ways. And by the mid-70s in New York, the city had been through over a decade of fiscal downturn, and the city had slashed municipal budgets and therefore social services, and the government and businesses had abandoned swaths of buildings in the city, but for the most part had not yet torn them down. So we can go to the next slide, I think. The exhibition includes the work of over 20 artists and includes photography, painting, film, drawing, sculpture, and ephemeral materials. And we may touch on many of these artists and works, but for tonight we've asked 4 really wonderful thinkers to speak specifically on 4 artists, on Gordon Matta-Clark, on Alvin Baltrop, Joan Jonas, and David Hammons. And through these artists' varied practices and lived experiences, we'll hope to understand or to capture a sense of the ways that the city was and remains material and inspiration, specter, and provocation. So we can go to the next one. I think might be the last of my slides, sure. I really want to thank our 4 speakers who are joining us from near and very far, mostly very far. One of the silver linings of doing this virtually. And I'm happy to introduce them now in the order that they will be making their short presentations as a way of sort of beginning this evening. After the presentations, we'll come back together for a conversation and encourage the audience to ask questions using the Q&A feature here on Zoom, and we'll reserve some time for audience questions at the end. So let me get right to it. First, we have Frances Richard, who is an art critic and poet. She's the author of Gordon Matta-Clark, Physical Poetics, which is a beautiful tome that provides a close analysis of Matta-Clark's writing, art, and life, and was published in 2019. Randall Wilcox is a New York-based artist, independent curator, and writer, and Wilcox worked closely with Alvin Baltrop during his life and is a trustee of the Alvin Baltrop Trust. He has curated a number of exhibitions of Baltrop's work. Judith Rodenbeck is an art historian. She's associate professor and chair of media and cultural studies at University of California, Riverside. And her writing and research engages with performance studies, the politics of aesthetics, and contemporary artistic practices. And she'll be speaking this evening about Joan Jonas. And Elena Filipovic is director and curator of Kunsthalle Basel in Switzerland and is the author of David Hammons' Bliz-aard Ball Sale, which was published in 2017 and is an in-depth look at one of Hammons' most enigmatic works and also a project that allows for incredible insight into the artist's practice and engagement with public art. So I think we'll get right into it.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody out there in Zoom land. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the Whitney team. I'm really happy to meet you all in the ether and to be with these scholars from whom I learned so much to discuss these artists whose work, all of them, has meant so much to me. I'm going to read from my little script here because otherwise I'll get lost in Gordon Matta-Clark detail and go on for too long. Most of you likely know something about Matta-Clark, so I'm just going to focus on the works that are in the exhibition around Day's End. And here he is in that piece, Day's End, our man on the piers, Gordon Matta-Clark, American artist, died at age 35 of cancer. He trained as an architect. He made films, photographs, drawings, performances, artist's books, standalone sculptures. But he's best known for doing what he did here, which is to cut up abandoned buildings, to make geometrically pierced walk-in environments. Day's End is also sometimes called Day's Passing, and it was made in the middle of the short decade of his career in 1975. Next slide, please. Matta-Clark made 7 large-scale cuts in the United States and Europe, and at times he was invited into a building by a cultural institution or a patron. But in this case, for his only large-scale cut in New York City, he broke into the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Pier at Gansevoort Street. Here's this image that you already saw. This was the heart of the gay cruising scene that Alvin Baltrop was documenting and would continue to document. He was caught, Gordon was, and sued by the Port Authority for trespass and vandalism. But it was 1975 and the city was in fiscal crisis, and they dropped the suit pretty quickly. Matta-Clark liked to frame his interventions as participatory occasions, and he thought of cities as growing, decomposing organic entities. He spoke about Day's End as, quote, a sun and water temple and a festival of light and water. And he rhapsodized about the 19th century steel truss building as, quote, a dark basilica-like space. So he was thinking about the movement of sun and the passage of daylight over the water, in and out of the built form. And he was not averse to speaking of this in quasi-mystical terms. However, his mysticism was almost entirely material. It's my understanding that in Matta-Clark's thought, binary oppositions like material and mystic merge and blur and hybridize their powers. Next slide, please. As Laura said, the cut had 5 constituent parts. So I can't use my mouse, but you'll see in the upper right-hand corner the sail-shaped cut on the river-facing facade of the pier. Below it is the quadrant cut that's open to the water of the Hudson, and just above that you can barely see light leak from a cut in the eaves that took off the square corner of the eaves of the building. To the far left of the screen is what he called the river door on the downtown side of the building. And the canal-like cut that's in the middle at the top was also open to the river. We're looking down it from the river door, so it met the river door exactly. And the piled segments of beams that we saw Gordon standing on in my first slide came out of these floor cuts. You can see that he left little bridges. The piece was illegal, but he wanted people to see it, and friends and, as you see, their children did come. Even the Village Voice came, and that was how he got busted by the Port Authority. Matta-Clark had a habit of handing the camera to other people. And I always like to point out that much of the film of Day's End was shot by Betsy Sussler, who was the founder and editor of Bomb magazine. And you can tell that Gordon made the titles in the film because he spelled her name wrong. Can we have the next slide, please? Matta-Clark had worked on the piers before. This is documentation of a performance for an exhibition titled Projects Pier 18 that was organized by the editor and curator and downtown art scene kind of impresario Willoughby Sharp. A few years earlier in 1971, all the works in Projects Pier 18 were documented by the photographic team of Shunk Kender. Matta-Clark's stunt of hanging upside down above the little Christmas tree is modeled explicitly on the figure of the hanged man in tarot, who symbolizes surrender, altered perspective, acceptance of the forces of the world like gravity, and entering into a kind of trickster initiation. Next slide. This is the piece that he wanted to make for Projects Pier 18, which would have been a little train of barges planted with kind of pocket parks. You see again the little bridges in between them that would have been anchored on the Hudson. So again, a gathering space, organic growth, a sense of liminal suspension in this case on the water itself. Next slide. He had also worked on the East River. This is Jack's, a project for another group show, also in 1971. And this one was on the Brooklyn Bridge, in the plaza under the Brooklyn Bridge on the Manhattan side. It was called the Brooklyn Bridge Event. and was organized by another good pal of Gordon's, Alana Heiss, who a couple years later would found PS1. The slides are a little hard to read, but this is a group of junked car chassis that he jacked up with a car jack to make a kind of precarious lean-to shelter. The photographs you're looking at are by Matta-Clark's partner in the early 1970s, the dancer and photographer Carol Gooden. And if I had more time, I would spend some time discussing the language in this run-on title, which to my mind really is as important as the images. This photo spread appeared in the magazine Avalanche, which was edited by Liza Baer and Willoughby Sharp, who organized Projects Pier 18. So all these downtown art folks knew each other and worked together, the sculptors and dancers and musicians and filmmakers and editors and curators and writers all collaborating. Next slide. Of all the works I could choose from these interlocutors in early Soho, I'll just show these. And I have the impression that you will see both of these works again. And what I want to emphasize about them is that these are works by two women artists, Trisha Brown and Joan Jonas, a dancer and an installation artist and video and performance artist heavily influenced by dance and physical performance, both of whom were massively influential on Matta-Clark. So to the left is Man Walking Down the Side of a Building by Trisha Brown, which is performed here by Joseph Schlichter and photographed by, again, Carol Gooden. Carol also danced in the Trisha Brown Company. And on the right is Song Delay by Joan Jonas. That's Gordon painting the circle and Carol in the middle of the circle, and the dog just in front of Gordon, between Gordon and the car, is Carol's dog Glaza, who was known as the art dog of Soho. Next slide. There are also many things to say about Matta-Clark's art and sensibility, and those of David Hammons, having to do with tricksterism, the city and its refuse, about the ready-made and other Duchampian precedents, about language play, about ritual and failure and decay and ephemerality and fertility. But I will highlight at this moment just their anti-authoritarianism and end with this pair of shots in which a Berlin cop in Gordon's case and a New York City cop in Hammons's case arrive right on time to play the straight man roles in the middle of artistic actions. And it just so happens that a photographer is on hand to document the proceedings. So we're going to show you now a short clip from footage shot for the film Days End. Matta-Clark made a film of this cut, as he often did, and he shot a lot of extra footage. What we're going to see, it was not included in the cut that he made, but it was excavated from his archive by the curator and filmmaker Hilla Peleg in 2019. The clip is about 2 minutes long, 2.5 minutes long. It's silent. And I just wanted you to see that play of sunlight and water penetrating the building.
Alvin Baltrop's earliest surviving photograph is an excellent example of the visual style that would dominate the majority of his work in a career that spanned for 40 years. In 1965, the teenage Baltrop focused his camera on a stranger in a quiet moment alone while at the cloisters in New York's Fort Tryon Park. He uses concentrated lighting on a single figure who is unaware that there is a person capturing their appearance. This is not a young man's photograph, with its sparse composition and austere beauty. Baltrop was an old-fashioned kind of artist in that his work is essentially a visual record of his life and things that he, in his own words, desired, enjoyed, or felt worth looking at. Next slide, please. This is one of several photographs that Baltrop shot of Pier 52 after Matta-Clark converted it into Days End. This person who you see kind of at the center toward the right of the composition, they're being lit by light, by light that's coming in through the first major cut that Matta-Clark made on the side of the pier. And Al took a lot of photographs of people actually interacting with the space. Yeah, Matta-Clark said that he wanted Days End to be a sort of an urban oasis or a sun and water temple. And with the Baltrop's photographs, Baltrop actually shows people enjoying the space as he intended. So what you had with the result is an interesting unintentional collaboration because it's unintentional. Next slide, please. Okay, this is one of Baltrop's portraits. A lot of people think that only gay men went to the piers, but women also did go there. This woman was at the piers. And one of the best things that he was able to do was photograph architecture. And aside from that, he was really great at photographing people's faces. And again, just talk the whole map talking about textures and decay. You can see the texture of the eroded door and of the wall that this woman is behind. I don't know which pier specifically this was taken at. Next slide. Okay, yeah, so the piers was also the source of a number of murders. It was also a dumping ground for certain criminals. There was in the 70s there was a serial killer who was stalking gay men at S&M bars, and this person, the corpse in the middle of the photograph, this is a person from that from one of who may have been from one of those killings. The movie Cruising was based on this, and one of the detectives who was in the film Cruising, and he also worked on the real life case trying to catch a serial killer, he is on the very left side of the photograph. So it's very interesting to see how Baltrop's photographs reflect what was going on in that film. Yeah, that's that. Thank you. Oh, one more, I forgot about this one. This photograph just shows how sophisticated his visual style is. If you notice, the first thing you notice is on the left side, there's a woman laying down, a woman in red pants. And you don't know, is she sleeping, is she drunk, is she dead, what's going on? And when you follow from where she is to the center of the photograph, you see a car there. The car's doors open, and then on the right side of the photograph, there's somebody who's like running. Looks like he's running toward the piers. So he was really great at capturing these really brief, kind of ambiguous moments of city life. He was interested in extremes, but he was also interested in ambiguities and mystery as well.
Oh, Randall, I think we're not able to hear the audio, but maybe you could say a little bit about what we're seeing in the film.
Actually, I have a transcription of it, and I can just let you know what's going on. I basically asked, that was an interview I shot with Al in 2000, and I asked him why his work wasn't shown a lot, and he received a lot of really, really hostile reactions. Specifically, what he says is basically a woman called him a sewer rat because of the kind of photographs that he was taking, and she was really offended by him. So that was essentially what he was talking about. He was very, very outspoken about things like that.
I don't show my work too often because I get such evil response.
Like what, for example?
One woman says, as I turn the pages of your portfolio, I can honestly say, I'm afraid of your portfolio. And I said, why? She says, because I'm afraid of seeing my husband or my son pop up in one of your photographs. And she said, you must be a real sewer rat, that you crawl around at night and photograph things like this. So I have to consider you a real sewer rat type of person. And I don't know if I like you. I closed my book and walked out.
Yeah, there you go. That's Alvin Baltrop.
Tell me the Robert Mapplethorpe story again. I want to put it in the trailer for the documentary.
Yeah, Mapplethorpe was an asshole. He was, in his own way, a bigoted, racist motherfucker. He walked up to me one evening and said, if you pose for me, I'll give you $50 and a gram of coke. I said, if you pose for me, I'll give you a decent fucking portfolio for yourself. And he threw himself back like, ugh. Put his drink down, turned around and walked out. I said, bye. I had talked to a couple of girls I know. They had went to school with him. And they knew more about him than anybody else out here. Well, she said, if he gets in your face ever again, or you want to get in his face, walk up to him and say, what happened to your ROTC uniform? Next time I see him, I did that to him, and he went, huh? I said, yeah, your ROTC cadet uniform. And he knew I had been talking to somebody who knew his shit. I said, okay, bye-bye. And my boy was looking like somebody had cut his balls off. And he just backed up and left the bar. This is a bar on 4th Street and 2nd Avenue. The bar. Baby, that bar and me went through more shit together. I had done more drugs than I had ever done. When the plane crashed, we were near the carrier. They said, boats away. Baltrop ate his strip, laid aside, and he became me a big net with a long pole on it. We take the water and fish it through, and the captain would be up there and he got this big searchlight. He would put the little searchlight on me. And Baltrop, point over here, he'd point over here. Baltrop, look where I'm pointing. He said, just take the stick and run it through the water. And I did. And I pulled up the helmet with the guy's head in it. I moved back. He said, all right, let's pull the boat in because it's too dangerous out there for you. We got the helmet, and when we got the helmet, we turned it over and half the head dropped out. They gave me plastic bags, and I picked up and put it in the plastic bags. And then they took it down to the freezer, and they put it into another bag, and they stuck it in there and froze it. You understand what I'm saying?
Right.
So that was that was enough.
And did that bother you while you were doing it, or like what was your?
I wouldn't let it bother me. I wanted to do it. Only thing was pissed me off is I was not able to take photographs because I was working.
Hi, speaking to you from Los Angeles, where I sit on Tongva land. Judith Rodenbeck here. I'm going to talk to you about Joan Jonas's work, Song Delay, which is a large screen projection in the show accompanying this David Hammons commission project. Song Delay is a film made in 1973 from a performance that took place down in what is now Battery Park City. So I want to kind of set the scene and talk a little bit about how Jonas's work has been framed. The artist Mary Miss says, in the early 70s, one of the few large open spaces in Manhattan was the landfill that has become Battery Park City. And that site became an available ground before it got built up for a number of art projects. So in the late 70s and early 80s, Creative Time sponsored a series of sculptural exhibitions called Art on the Beach. In the fall of 1979, there was a massive anti-nuclear rally on that land. One of the better known pieces that took place on that land is Agnes Deans's Wheat Field, A Confrontation of 1982, in which she planted a wheat field and then harvested that wheat with the support of the Public Art Fund. So Jonas staged this piece, Song Delay, down on that site. And it's one of a series of outdoor works that she performed in extended landscapes with and without camera and with and without documentation. If I could have the next slide. Great. So, for example, Joan's beach piece, this is all in and around or within a certain ambit of New York City. Joan's beach piece is a movement piece with sculptural elements, also designed importantly, investigating things like deep and shallow space, and those investigations are made particularly piquant by the use of the camera. So framing for view is important. It's one of her ongoing concerns, as is audience placement. Where are viewers or perceivers placed with regard to movement and the movement of bodies? If I could have the next slide, please. This slide changing is very old school. It's quite weird. And Delay is a piece that was not made for film, but was documented photographically, that is some of the grounding material for Song Delay. So here you see the image that Frances showed a little bit earlier of Delay, photographed by Gianfranco Gorgoni. And in this piece, this photograph, you can see some typical elements of Jonas's work of this particular period. And she's a great bricoleur of her own archive and recycle certain kinds of motifs and elements. The circle moving from horizontal to vertical, the circle as a rotational device, the circle as enclosure, the line in relation to the circle, implying both movement and stillness. These are repeated motifs of her project. Could I have the next slide, please? There. So here's some stills culled from Song Delay. You can view the full quote film, now digital video, on Ubu Web, but you can also see it at the Whitney. In the film of the performance, there is a continual play between deep space and shallow space, the use of varying lenses to give a wide view versus a telescopic deep view, a play between multiple players and performers and individuated performers, or even parts of performers. And again, that circle motif as a rotational device, as a measurement device. Jonas is interested in the work in questions of deep and shallow space, of sound reverberation. So a sound is made using the same fundamental movements, whether it's clapping, clapsticks, or speech. It takes a different amount of time to get to the recording device, depending on how close the making of the sound is to that device. So you actually visually perceive the delay in delivery of the information to the equipment. Performers in this particular piece included Carol Gooden and Gordon Matta-Clark, as well as Steve Paxton, Robin Winters, Ariel Bach, Marianne Kajuri, a number of friends in this friendship circle in the downtown arena. I want to emphasize in thinking about this piece the ways in which it has been received. So there's one writer who speaks of it as choreographing a theater of space, movement, and sound, with the urban landscape as a feature and an emphasis on gesture and this use of props to structure both frame and physical movement. For me, the tension between perception and traversal, how you move through space, and how you organize that space is a continuing element in Jonas's work. It's sort of inaugurated a few years before this piece, but it is a kind of through line to the narrative of her project. Next slide, please. So Song Delay is a project of 1973. I've just showed you a couple of projects from 1970, 72. And it's part of an array of projects by women artists taking place in downtown New York in the late 60s and early 70s, many of whom had been through Judson dance practice in one way or another, though not all were dancers. These are two pieces by Trisha Brown, the Roof piece of 1971, photographed by Babette Mangolt, who's a longtime sort of collaborative documentarist of many downtown dance projects, and Man Walking Down the Side of a Building from 1970. Both of these works using urban space as sort of prop and backdrop, but I'll try to suggest using it slightly more deliberately in a second. Next slide, please. This is a project that the artist Mary Miss did in 1973, also in the Battery Park landfill, which she describes this way. The unimposing structures held a series of clearly articulated concentric circles descending into the ground. So again, this kind of motif of a primary form, the circle, then working in a very interesting way with the ground that is also the ground. She continues, it appeared as though a column of air was being defined as it tunneled into the ground. The circles are marking out the distance to materialize the space. So it's a kind of conical intersect, an implied conical intersect into the base of Manhattan. Next slide, please. And last but not least of this little array, some of you will recognize the image on the left from Rosalind Krauss's essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. This is another Mary Miss project. And I put it in here just as a kind of reminder and prompt that in terms of art criticism, the ways that many of these projects were being written about and thought about was as a kind of early venture into postmodern critique. And they were being thought about in terms of structure. So David Hammons has described his new intervention as a sculptural intervention, and in the video that the Whitney has accompanying this commission, he mentions its ephemerality, the discussion of the abstraction. And this is also how Jonas's project has been received. Next slide, please. I want to think slightly differently about the question of parallax. In 1974, the director Alan Pakula directed a movie called The Parallax View. It's a thriller about a reporter who investigates a secret corporation called the Parallax Corporation, whose primary focus is political assassination. And he realizes that all of these kinds of political facts, events, and sort of accidental deaths that surround political figures are in fact orchestrated by this corporation. It's complicated. It's a great movie. It's very bleak and sort of interest in our moment. And I want to borrow this word parallax a little bit. We just talked about conical intersect, and appropriate and misuse a quote from the critic Hal Foster from his essay, Postmodernism and Parallax of 1993. He writes, in April 1992, I spent a few days in Detroit, a city occupied 3 times by the Army, wounded by white flight, damaged by Reagan-Bush neglect. There, the white tourist tends to travel from one cosmetic fortress to another. On one such trek, my group stopped at Highland Park, the primary site of the Ford Model T, the first factory with an assembly line, the paradigm of Taylorist labor around the modern world. On cue, our taxi, a Ford, broke down. And so we were stranded at this rusted plant, perhaps the most important site in the 20th century industry, now lost between a de-industrial city core and a post-urban residential ring, witness to the uneven development of our late capitalist space-times in a purgatory between modern and postmodern worlds. There again, I again saw that the category of postmodernism might still be used to think such a strange chronotropic terrain, one not unique to Detroit, of fortressed cities armored against urban inhabitants and industrial remains suspended in twilight zones. How does one map such a space, measure such a time? So I quote Foster at length because I think he accidentally provides a very interesting way to think about this Jonas project in its moment and what it means to us looking at it now from the space of 2020 and a 2020 New York that is dramatically altering its terrain. Next slide, please. So I'm also interested in the cameraman for this piece, cameraman Robert Fiore. Bob Fiore was a minor figure in the downtown arena. He had PA'd for Shirley Clark's Portrait of Jason. He made a documentary in 1967 for Life Against War. He is probably best known as the director of the 1977 movie Pumping Iron. And for my purposes, he also was involved in the 2008 unfortunate film, The Happening. But he's the sound man for Spiral Jetty in 1970. He is the producer and cinematographer of The Winter Soldier in 1972. In 1974, he worked on the film Janus, and he also happened to be one of 3 camera people for Richard Serra's Prisoner's Dilemma of 1974. And the other 2 were Babette Mangold, again, and Mark Obenhaus. Next slide, please. So I want to think a little bit about urban space and what it means for women in particular to inhabit that urban space in 1970, 71, 72, 73, 74, in the early 70s, and what those kinds of circuits of social connection are that document that kind of intervention in urban space. So I'm showing you Adrian Piper's Catalysis 3 and 4, photographs by Rosemary Mayer, also a downtown artist and one of the founders of AIR Gallery, which was founded in 1970, I think it's 1972, yeah, AIR Gallery. And on the right, Piper in 1973 begins her Mythic Being series, which appears as inserts. You can see the lower left-hand second column in a photograph with a thought balloon, yes, thank you, of Piper as the mythic being inserted into the Village Voice. This kind of viral appearance in public space of a variety of kinds. Next slide, please. Or Martha Rossler's The Bowery in Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems, also in this very smart show from 1974-75. That is the same period that Jonas is making this, this work. Next slide, please. Two projects, also 1974 by Richard Serra, who Jonas had been involved with, I'm not sure what their status was at this point, Prisoner's Dilemma and Boomerang. Prisoner's Dilemma is a video that sort of games out the classic game theory problem of the prisoner's dilemma, in which you are given multiple bad choices and forced to make one, and any one of those choices is going to impact some other person in a negative way. And in Boomerang, the video, the sculptor Nancy Holt speaks and hears herself in echo delay. So there's a delay, and describes the experience of what it is like to hear her voice speaking and arriving in her ears on a delay. So there's a sort of instant feedback loop about a kind of dissociational type of process. In Sarah's words, she's asked to respond to her own words, which she hears through a feedback system. She states what is happening to her as it is happening, her relation to herself as a subject. Next slide, please. These are two related images. The first is a still from Song Delay, and I put the second one in here just to make a little bit easier to read the device circle that is in the image on the left. The image on the right is from a versioning that was done on the banks of the Thames in London in 2018. So Battery Park, just to sort of wrap up, Battery Park was a major land reclamation and development project at the edge of what had been, from the late 19th century until after World War II, an area known as Little Syria, populated by immigrants from the Levant and Eastern Europe, most of them Christian refugees from the Ottoman Empire. The Battery Park Reclamation Project was initiated in 1968 and overseen by a New York State public, quote, quote, public benefit corporation. The project operated in tandem with the development of Lower Manhattan. And during the construction of the World Trade Center, the New York City Water Tunnel, and the dredging of the harbor off Staten Island, more than 3 million cubic yards of earth and other construction debris found their way into the water on the west side of Lower Manhattan, gradually displacing and replacing rotten piers with expanding solid ground. That landfill was completed in the summer of 1976. And for those of us old enough to remember, this major public-private partnership development effort was overseen by Harry Helmsley. And some of us remember the Queen sleeps here. That's Leona Helmsley, Harry Helmsley's, well, was a widow and no longer, the late Leona, or Taxes Are for Little People. So engaged in this, the use of this actual site is a set of questions that remain unarticulated fully, that have to do with development, with temporality, with duration and delay, with displacement, and with the relationship, the scalar relationship between the human and this large development project. I have, yeah, one more slide, last slide. Jonas, I like the device circle element, what I call the device circle, basically the circle line, which as a kind of formal element structures the movement of individuals in this kind of mechanistic ratcheting back and forth along the line, moving around the circle. It's basically like a watch mechanism. But it also speaks to something about the use of language, because the circle line, of course, is one of the ferries that circles around Manhattan. So this is a still from the interior of Song Delay, in which a boat, it's not the circle line, but it's a boat, passes by. What you hear is the foghorn of the boat passing by, and you see the individual, the dancer, clack these pieces of wood, and then the sound gets to you several seconds later. Jonas says in another context, but I think it's useful, at least for me, look how much of a communicational system depends upon the proper internalization of the system. So I'm suggesting that one of the ways this work has been received has been formal, and simply about pattern and structure. But once you step back from that, and in fact, this show provides a great occasion for doing so, it is a project that begins to ask questions about that feature in the background, the feature in the middle ground, and the feature in the foreground as inhabited spaces. And that's it for me. Thanks. Look forward to questions.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, world watching, and esteemed, inspiring colleagues. I join you from Basel, Switzerland, where it's 1 a.m. almost. Luckily, I'm a night owl, but I'll get right to it. I will start with the first image, please. I'll start with a set of images that can be found in the Whitney exhibition, taken by the amazing photographer Dawood Bey in 1981, and recording for eternity 2 acts by the artist David Hammons. Now, I hesitate to say performed by David Hammons for several reasons, although they raise interesting questions about the definitions of performance. And I would say these questions they resonate so much with everything we've heard tonight about the definitions of performance. For instance, when does an urban guerrilla intervention qualify as an artwork, as performance? The definition of sculpture, can a temporary act, an ephemeral form, take on the status of sculpture for the time that it exists? The question of ownership, who owns public space? And also importantly, another kind of ownership, that of authorship. When one artist creates a work on top of another artist's work, even vandalizes it, if you will, who owns the memory and meaning of it? I would venture that exactly the muddy waters that these particular acts and their documentation make apparent are the muddy waters, the same muddy waters that Gordon Matta-Clark sailed into, and uniting these two artists in ways that will be apparent, I think, as we progress, even if I'll only speak today to Hammons directly. Now, David Hammons needs little introduction. Many of you will know that he came of age as an artist in LA before moving permanently to New York City in 1974, where his art, made from culturally loaded material realities of African-American existence, have left an indelible mark on us. His hair sweepings from black barbershops, deep fried chicken wings, Thunderbird and night train bottles, basketballs, greasy paper bags, and Harlem dirt. There's a kind of sarcastic wit that accompanies the slipshod irregularity of his arrangements and the marks of jazz that one feels everywhere in his practice. Now, there's just one step, I'd say, between those deliberately flimsy but loaded objects and David's lifetime of mostly unannounced actions. And it should be said, we probably wouldn't be speaking about these actions at all by Hammons if they had not been so carefully and beautifully recorded by his close friend, Dawood Bey, which raises a question that I hope we'll come back to in the panel, and it sounds like we probably will, given how much it resonates with what we've heard tonight, concerning the particular role of the photographic record in relation to ephemeral acts, as important in Matta-Clark's case as in Hammons. Now, I'd like to look closely at each of Bey's photos that are part of the Whitney exhibition. But before we do so, I want to go perfect. I want to zoom out a bit to speak of the context. This is the corner that we're looking at, the corner of Franklin Street and West Broadway in New York, a corner David walked by regularly as it was on his way to the just above Midtown gallery, or Jam, as it was affectionately known, founded by the intrepid and amazing Linda Bryant. So he would have seen this piece as it basically was erected. He described his frustration in conversations we had about seeing this hulking monolith occupy public space, this massive 36-foot tall, 72-ton Corten steel, officially commissioned, expensively produced piece of public art. And it was, in his opinion, an epitome of white American imperialist art. So without telling anyone, next slide, please, he, which is to say no announcement, and here's a closer view of the series of Dawood Bey's photos. Next slide, please. Without telling anyone, which is to say no announcement, no invite, no audience, he goes over numerous nights and throws about 25 pairs of shoes of different sorts that he has tied together by their shoelaces so that they dangle over the top edges of Sarah's monument. And you have to imagine him sort of doing this act, that would have had a very particular urban folkloric resonance. A pair of shoes connected by their laces and flung over a power line has long been a kind of vernacular present in US cities. It signaled a gang den or an end of school year or some kind of territorial claim. Hammons takes this unruly folk tradition and he uses it to give Sarah's monument curves, to make it softer, as he said, more human. It also made Sarah's imposing work into a kind of pedestal for Hammons' sculpture. And we don't know how long this family of shoes dangled there, or how many people noticed, or do we know if the assemblage was found by officials and removed before TWU, the title of Sarah's piece, was itself disassembled on the 30th of July, 1981. Its life was always meant to be temporary. We do know that one night in 1981, before it came down, Hammons brought Dawood Bey to see Shoe Tree, telling him that there was a work of his that no one knew about, presumably this one, Shoe Tree. Next slide. As he was showing Bey the work, he began to urinate on the Sarah. That gesture and everything that followed it would become the work Pissed Off. It was another act of countering the brute material strength and the rigid geometries of this hulking public sculpture. And of course, Hammons was not alone in urinating on the sculpture. It had become a kind of open dumpster, as you can see from the picture. But Hammons is alone in having kind of declared it art and made his act into a performance of sorts. Next slide, please. Now, as he's showing Bey, and next slide again, a police comes upon the scene. And Bey describes a scenario where he just sort of backed up and knew to start shooting and clicking without having been instructed, without anyone having planned this. And the policeman unexpectedly arrives, asks David for his ID. In one of the pictures that we just saw, you see David kind of getting out his documents, trying to find his ID. And we know all of this happened thanks to Bey's photographs, his clandestine documentation, as he called it, of a non-performance. Now, David gave it all a title, deploying his typical play on words, double entendre, Pissed Off, announcing both the sentiment that he has in relation to the Sarah piece, but also his bodily reaction. And we know from the way David dealt just a few years later with Bliz-aard Ball Sale, his sale of snowballs on the street of New York, and here you see a picture of it, that David very carefully selected and decided on the context for circulating his images. In the case of Pissed Off, it's incredibly telling that he selected exactly those images, I'd say. And let's go back to the previous slide, sorry. A Black man interrogated by the police, ruffling through his belongings to get his documents, having to explain himself. Now, I won't really speak much at all about Bliz-aard Ball Sale tonight. Next slide. Another public space project that David did, but I'd like to quickly show some images of it and draw some parallels between these two acts. Now, you have to imagine it's the coldest winter day you can conjure in New York City. An epic blizzard had just covered the city with snow. It was 1983, so 2 years later now. And David Hammons, who is without a gallery to officially represent him, still without announcing what he's doing is art. Again, in this instance, he positions himself among street sellers in the Lower East Side. He had observed those sellers day after day and night after night, hawking secondhand things near Cooper Union. And go to the next slide, please. So amongst them, he sort of sets himself up as a kind of sales stand with his very regimented, very ordered dozens of snowballs, each perfectly round and arranged by size, largest to smallest. To anyone walking by, and here you have a perfect example, it was either laughably absurd or painfully desperate or a radically poetic act, or maybe all of these things at once. David stood out there in the icy cold, dressed with a scarf around his neck, colorful mittens, and he sold snowballs to whoever would buy them for $1 each until they were sold. Next slide, please. Now, and here you get a small picture of the audience that would have encountered this act, mostly white university students and sort of people circulating around the area. And from the documentation that we do have, we know that the customers, and this is something that Dawood Bey also underscores, were all white. Now, Pissed Off, like Bliz-aard Ball Sale, has become iconic. No one in the art world actually saw the acts And during the years I spent researching Bliz-aard Ball Sale, I realized that few people or sources even knew the most basic facts about Bliz-aard Ball Sale. And pretty much the same could be said about Pissed Off as well. But what circulated instead was a kind of myth buttressed by a select few images that everyone more or less knew. So on the one hand, David made these incredibly ephemeral works. After all, what could be more ephemeral than throwing shoes on a public monument or pissing on it or later making and selling snowballs? And all of this is sort of in lockstep with his fierce position against being preoccupied by posterity. I'm looking forward, I'm not looking back, is something that he's said several times. And that's part of what we know about him most readily, or even what we could come to expect from his reputation. On the other hand, we know about these acts, Shoe Tree, Pissed Off, Bliz-aard Ball Sale, and they've become legendary partly because he made sure to make them, to have them photographed. He was thinking about their record, about their inscription and history and posterity. And I should add, it's no coincidence that over the years, David has had so many photographer friends who he regularly engaged to photograph what he was doing. We can't forget that Marcel Duchamp is now kind of Duchamp to us, partly because he made sure that his ephemeral gestures were captured by Man Ray. And I would say throughout the 80s and 90s, Dawood Bey was David Hammons' Man Ray in a way. But it's not enough to have the images taken. They have to be seen. And all of these images that I've shown you tonight, they were not seen right away. It was only some years later that they started to circulate, after some years after the acts. And when David did begin to circulate them, he put out there a very careful selection of images. Just one of Shoe Tree, so it was a very tight edit, 4 of Pissed Off, 2 to 3 images of Bliz-aard Ball Sale circulated. He was careful about where and how and when he circulated them. And in order to understand this, I want to also briefly, say a few words about the moment in which they were made. Because in order to talk about these pieces, one can't forget that it's 1981, which is to say Ronald Reagan has just become president. And that's to say a different actor turned politician is in charge of the country at that time than the one we have now. Public services are being defunded. The rich are getting tax cuts. The art market is thriving. In particular, the gentrification of the Lower East Side is booming. And unemployment is at one of its all-time highs. Homelessness is raging. And a drug epidemic is booming too. And then it's not Oxycontin, but crack. So, and with that, men and women of color are being stopped and frisked, are being profiled and killed by the police. Sound familiar? I mention all of this because although David's acts have long been seen as these absurd and humorous gestures, throwing shoes or pissing on a Richard Serra, or a few years later selling snowballs, and they are these things, they're light and humorous too. David's decision to put himself out on the street as he did is telling, and then to share photos of it even more so. To share photos of a Black man showing documentation of himself being interrogated by the police, or selling gradations of whiteness to essentially white customers is also telling. In David's work, there's always this mix, this wry humor, and you see the humor also in his titles, the way he plays with language, and the way he takes basically free material from the streets, and the way that this wry humor meets a mordant commentary on the inequities of his present. So to look closely at any of Hammons' works, I would say, and indeed these acts and this selection and circulation of images show us that what he's doing is making, in his way, an unforgiving portrait of the US, of its sort of bigoted slurs, its police brutality, and its material precarity, which he shows us as both wonky and improbably balanced, as a way to indict a larger system of social precarity, but also on the flip side to celebrate its make-do ability, its way of being poetic and beautiful at the same time. And I think, I will wrap up there, but I will just say I sense that it's exactly this way of indicting authority, but also showing the beauty and the precarity of it that unites everyone that we've heard tonight, sort of all the artists that have been the subject of these talks. And that makes me sort of happy that it makes perfect sense that we're all together and speaking as we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena and Francis and Judith and Randall. That was incredible and in many ways exactly what I sort of wanted to hear, but also raises so many questions and new, I don't know, ways of thinking about each of these artists. Oh good, now we're all big. I am very cognizant that we have already gone over time, that Elena is up way past my bedtime. But there are some great questions I think that some of us have thought about previously, but also from the audience. And I want to maybe just see where we get with one and see how that goes, which is a sort of combination. Jeffrey, who's in the audience, posed the question about the fascination behind a work that would be demolished, which I think maybe was specifically about Matta-Clark and thinking about Days End, but makes me also think of this other sort of bigger question that it is specific to Matta-Clark Days End, is specific to David Hammons sort of reimagined, I guess, Days End, but also to Baltrop working on the piers, or to Jonas thinking about the relationship between these spaces. And that is really not only what is the fascination behind a work that would be demolished or that has maybe a timestamp potentially, but then also how does Days End in this sort of broad form exist now? Or to think about it also in terms of the photographic document, what is the real Days End? And I don't know if anyone wants to take that on.
I'll jump in. To speak to the last question first, I don't think there is a real Days End. They're all Days End, and obviously the Hammons isn't built yet, and so Days End isn't done yet, I would say. To counter that, I would also say that if the city of New York or some millionaire patron had said to Gordon Matta-Clark, I will buy Pier 52 for you, and you can keep that piece there in perpetuity, I think he would have said, great. He was really savvy and wholehearted about working in ephemeral situations and working with ephemeral materials like light or like participation. But I always kind of want to be careful about romanticizing him as somebody whose work was constantly erased, because that really wasn't necessarily his choice, right? He was working, that's how he could get his hands on a building, was that he was going to do major damage to it in terms of typical uses. And so he didn't typically get to do that to a building that somebody was going to maintain. So like, as Elena was saying about Hammons, with that surreptitiousness and kind of secret agent art making through the interstices of the city, that's very Gordon. But it's not, as I tried to say in juxtaposing that image from Matta-Clark's piece that he made at the Berlin Wall, which was also illegal, he had multiple camera people there. And as Elena was saying, it's no accident that Dawood Bey was on hand. So there's ephemerality, but there's also an interest in documentation and resonance and whatever the opposite of ephemerality is without turning it into monumentality. right? A kind of deliberately fragile self-perpetuation. And I think that's true of Jonas too, in that she's, as Judith said a beautiful thing, that Joan is a bricoleur of her own archive. And she constantly remakes things. And that was true of Gordon Jonas, that's true of Joan after age 80, and it was true of Gordon in his early 30s, that he was constantly remaking and riffing and adding to. And somebody in the, I'll just wrap up by saying that somebody in the Q&A asked about Smithson, and I think that's a way that Smithson funnels in here, at least for Matta-Clark, is that Smithson is another figure who is riffed on and who also himself made works in packages, right? That, like, what is the real spiral jetty? It's the thing and the leg. No, it's the movie that Bob Fiore worked on. But most of us see the photographs first, and so those aren't not real. And I think all of that is true about Gordon, as well as about it's partly, it seems to me, why the Hammons is so appropriate as an homage that's also a ghosting, an erasure, a one-upmanship of Gordon.
I don't know, maybe no one else wants to jump in on that exactly. So I might just sort of, I don't know, throw one more question out, and maybe this will be it, even though I feel like we could talk about a lot of, I mean, in particular, the photographic record, which I'm glad you sort of touched on, Francis, is, yeah, I really think fascinating part of each of these artists' practice, and sort of a larger practice, really specifically even in the late 70s and 80s. But I did want to maybe ask how each of you might, I don't know, talk about these artists and their thinking about community. I see that one of the questions in the Q&A does really sort of question the romanticization of New York in the 70s, and in particular maybe the artists in Matta-Clark's circle and in Soho. So maybe there's something more complicated to think about how community exists or was imagined in New York at the time. And actually, maybe I'll pose this directly to Randall about Baltrop's work, just because he was really photographing and sort of immersed in a very particular community that found, used space in a very different way than I think we talk about when we talk about Matta-Clark, in that the piers were a safe place for more than art making. But also Baltrop was, hanging himself from straps to take these photos, and really sort of getting in the space in a way that I think has sort of resonance. But how then does that sort of work together with a sense of community?
Well, again, Baltrop showed Days End as being, well, as fulfilling its intended goal of being an urban oasis, as a sun and water temple. So on all these Baltrop photographs, actually it would have been great if Matta-Clark had seen them, but it shows that Matta-Clark's ultimate vision was completed, even though I believe he had to get to the country at the time to avoid a criminal prosecution.
I just want to say I really love and really agree with that idea, Randall, of Baltrop is documenting exactly what Matta-Clark said he wanted. And in fact, I think he genuinely did want that, not only at Days End, but in all the cuts, that he wanted them to be used, and that image where the sunlight through the cut becomes a spotlight for Baltrop in photographing. And there are a number of other Baltrop photographs where he uses the apertures of the Days End cut to help choreograph and frame his own shots. In some parallel art universe, I hope they have had a really good conversation about that.
Yeah, me too.
Sorry, it's prime dog walking hour here in California. The question is about community. And one of the things that was interesting to me is to start to track who is taking these pictures. So we know who Dawood Bey is. I had never really thought about Bob Fiore, but he's a really interesting guy. And if the reception of certain kinds of work has always been essentially formalist or at least, driven by structuralist and post-structuralist concerns, the provocation to me of something like thinking about sculpture in the expanded field is that expansion of the sculptural field stays within its boundaries, but you can flip it out and say, well, okay, let's expand that field to consider what the socius is, what is our habitus, what is our socius, who's around, who's circulating this stuff. And the nature of the photograph from 1964 forward for performance people in particular is as the sort of imprimatur of an event having happened, but it's also a problematic because it becomes the event, right? For many of these artists. And I think certainly that's true for the Happenings people, even the Fluxus people. That may be less of a problem for a slightly later generation. So Smithson's use of photography, all of those earthworks people and non-site people are using photography, partly because they have to, but it's also a kind of a grabbing onto this medium that circulates not just from friend to friend in New York, but gets sent to Argentina or Belgium or Tokyo, right? And reinterpreted. So there are multiple communities. There are people you eat dinner with, there are people you sleep with, there are people you eat dinner with, there are people you send stuff to, and then there are people who are making work that is in dialogue with your work. And that is often happening through photography and the printed magazine. So Avalanche and Bomb and those types of projects are actually key to developing a kind of community. So I think about Rikrit Tirvanija making dinner, that show that all of us didn't go to, that is the show that becomes foundational for relational aesthetics and legendary in New York. Like Jerry Saltz went and ate whatever it was, pad thai, and so he's in the group. That's a kind of community, but that's very particular, and it's almost like a kind of oral tradition that you have to transfer. I have to speak directly to you, and you have to hear me, versus sending off a letter someplace. So the photographers are there, and we are always put in the position of the person behind the camera, because what we have is the result of the camera's grabbing of the event. Right, so we don't see the other offsite stuff. So for me, thinking about Bob Fiore and anti-war work in the 70s, it's the Christmas bombing is happening. I forget the year 72, 70. Like Vietnam is being sort of wiped out. There are many things happening. This anti-nuclear demonstration down in Battery Park. Those are signals that those sites have a life, and the life is material and it's social, and it's not just about a formal gesture. So, I mean, that to me is the importance of Hammons pissing on that Sarah sculpture. Because the same thing happened at Tilted Arc, and it smelled unbelievable because people used it that way. That was a kind of community. So that's a very weird non-answer, but it's a sort of riff on thinking about what the space is. One other thing, Soho in the 70s was not what it looks like now, and not even what it looked like in the 1990s. It was frightening. It was really scary to be there. The kitchen was like 3 floors up in some rickety, shitty old, brick building. It was falling apart, but it was propped up by artists practically squatting those spaces. And I think that's important to understand that the physical infrastructure that was there was not what we see today, but it was the leftovers of basically the shipping industry and you know, the transportation of material goods into Lower Manhattan. So that's also about the memory that's embedded in this this kind of space. I think this is the genius of this Hammons project is I think Elena used the word ghosting. I mean, it is a kind of place, there's an interesting ghost quality there that's also resilient, right?
And just to pick up on that, I think, you know, one of the things that has united all of these talks is the way that we can talk about all of these gestures because we have these traces that that remain of them. And I mean, for me, sort of the epitome of Hammons being known as this sort of fugitive, hustling, trickster who, you know, avoided the art system by not having a gallery, not having a website, sort of directly controlling everything about the way in which he dealt with the art world and avoiding all the usual means through which artists are represented or circulated or distributed, and telling the world through refusing to do exhibitions or interviews in the last few decades that he was not interested in posterity, that he was not going to be captured. And yet when you look back at the photographic record and you realize, you know, how much he made sure that everything was documented and then controlled or, you know, carefully selected and tightly edited what did circulate, that there was definitely a desire for these things not to disappear entirely, not to this, you know, tree that falls in a forest kind of thing. If no one's there to hear it or if no one's there to photograph it, did it happen at all? And the beautiful thing about the way that he goes back to Gordon Matta-Clark and finds a kindred spirit, someone else who was as interested as he was in ephemeral acts and in the power of these fragile, you know, gestures in public space, and claiming public space for the community that is not usually spoken for. And by making this homage to Gordon Matta-Clark, but doing it in a way that is spectral, that is there and not there at the same time, and yet very much needs to now, you know, needs a lot of fundraising, needs a lot of effort, needs a lot of construction, you know, so it's requiring a lot of work of a lot of people, but in order to always make us aware that there is something that's there and something that's missing, and that New York is not the same place that it was at the time.
Thank you for that. I think that's, yeah, those are sort of really important sentiments to sort of put forward in the thinking about the what the Hammons project is, and actually sort of takes us maybe back to a place to wrap up. But I also really loved hearing some of what, Elena, what you were saying about Hammons talking about the Sarah piece and the sort of expensively produced and privately commissioned, and to think about then how those two sort of methods for public sculpture how he could sort of rethink them, reuse them, reshape them for a project that in some ways has some of the same parameters. But I think now that we have really officially gone over everyone's probably Zoom capacity for the evening, I just really, I want to say thank you so much, Elena and Francis and Randall and Judith, for being with us tonight. This was really amazing for me. It seems like people enjoyed it from, you know, the faces that I can't see. And I want to really thank Megan Hoyer, the Whitney's Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement, for shaping such a inspired evening. And also a huge thanks to Andy Hawks, the coordinator of public programs and public engagement, and senior curatorial assistant Christy Mitchell, who actually made this evening happen. And for people that are still with us, a reminder that Around Days End is on view for a couple more weeks at the museum, if you are able to visit in person. And the David Hammons Days End project will be completed by the end of this year, and it is outdoors, and it is will be visible and invisible, I think. So I hope that everyone gets to sort of experience some of the things that we've talked about tonight. And yeah, thank you. Oh, also, I think this recording will go on the website if anyone needs to go back and review anything that was said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.